Welcome back to our study on the book of Revelation for our 7-part series on chapters 16 through 18, entitled The Seven Bowls of Wrath, Armageddon, and the Vision of the Fall of the Dragon Allies. Well, we've completed a 5-week section on chapter 16, and this video is part 6, split into 2, on lessons for chapter 17, entitled The Whore and the Beast. This is part B that we will be talking about today. Last week, we compared the woman of chapter 12 and the harlot in chapter 17. And what we discovered is a complete contrast. They are opposites in every way. Both of their positions will change by the end of the story in Revelation. We also summarized what this passage tells us about the harlot and made a list here. And then we proceeded to try to understand what all of these descriptions meant by hearing various commentary about it. We also discovered that in verse 18, this harlot is Babylon, the city. The real question is, what does Babylon represented? And we ended with a quote from Hendrickson, which says, "We must remember that this harlot is a worldly city named Babylon. It reminds us of the Babylon of old. It recalls to our mind that heathen center of wickedness and seduction, the city of Tyre." And we compare Revelation 17 and 18 with Ezekiel 27 and 28. Babylon must indicate the world as a center of industry, commerce, art, culture, etc., which by means of all these things seeks to entice and seduce the believer, that is, turn him or her away from God. It symbolizes the concentration of luxury, vice, and glamour of the world. What I'd like you to do now is to reread verses 7 through 18 on this and the next slides, or of course you can open your Bible. I will pause on each slide for 5 seconds and you can stop and start the presentation as is convenient. All right. This is the list we generated at the end or the beginning of last week, and we've checked off about half the boxes, which I thought that was pretty good progress. But today we're going to continue on with a few of those items that obviously we didn't get to. My first concern is that it's time to sort out all these beasts, and we need to do that from the get-go. So this and the next slide really focuses on all the names of the beasts and where we're finding them in the chapters throughout Revelation, and how to connect them all. First of all, Hasatan, and this is all in your handout, but maybe a slightly different format or details. Hasatan, which is Satan, the devil. Lucifer is another name. Okay, the other names that were given in chapter 9, you'll see, is Abaddon, Apollyon, the angel of the bottomless pit, the king of the pit, fallen star. In chapter 12, then, we were introduced to the red dragon, the accuser and deceiver, all of the same names for the same beast. In chapter 14, it's just called the beast. In chapter 16, he was called the prince of the air. In chapter 17, he will be the power behind the seventh king, and he will be the eighth king. And that's what's coming up here as we're talking about. In chapter 20, I figured I might as well include the rest of it. He's the beast that gets thrown into the pit for 1,000 years, will arise at one point to make war again, and then he will be thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity. So this is like your master diagram of who the heck Hasatan, devil, Satan, Lucifer all are, because all these different terms refer to one being. Now, let's sort out the other two beasts. One was first called the image of the beast, and referred to as the beast at some point also. Here is the spirit of Antichrist, or it's also called Antichrist. This was the sea beast in chapter 13, or the scarlet beast that the woman rides on in chapter 17. He's also the seventh king that will get mentioned here in chapter 17, and he gets thrown into the lake of fire in chapter 19, and it's restated in 20. Finally, the false prophet is the third one. It's mentioned in chapters 16 and 20. But in chapter 13, he's not called the false prophet. He's called the land beast. This person will be thrown into the lake of fire in chapters 19 and 20. I hope that straightens out some of the confusion, because there's been so many different names for each one of these that get used. And I really felt that at this point we needed to have kind of a little cheater sheet to help us. Let's continue on. Who are the many waters, the inhabitants of the earth? The description of the woman shown John includes many aspects which are similar to Babylon at the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah. There are also differences, but Babylon resided by numerous waters. Babylon was surrounded by the Euphrates, which divided to form many islands and a large lake nearby. The great harlot now sits on many waters, which are peoples and multitudes, nations and tongues. The great harlot seen by John influences a much wider realm than the Babylon of old, although the Babylon of old had quite the empire. Many waters. This is the first description that identifies the harlot as the world and its world system. The many waters are interpreted for us in verse 15 as peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. This, of course, describes the whole world. The waters of this lake symbolize the surging nations, people, etc. of this world that are constantly opposing and persecuting the church. According to William Hendrickson, these people who constitute the anti-Christian world turn against the whore, ultimately. KLEIN and Spears has an understanding from a Jewish perspective, which I always love to share. Who are those who are written or who are referred to as those who dwell on the earth and whose names have not been written in the book of life? They do not include mankind. In Hebrew thinking, all people start with their names written in the book of life. Some just happen to be so perverse that we actually tell God to erase us from the book, and thus we're removed from the book of life by our own evil actions and our rejection of God's invitation for a relationship with Him. The Hebraic perspective on the Bible is based on this, that all mankind is predestined for salvation. Yet, they are still free to determine their own eternal destiny by either accepting or rejecting God's plans for their life. So, who are those that dwell on the earth? According to KLEIN and Spears, they are the fallen angels and their offspring, the Nephilim. Remember, the Nephilim can never receive salvation. They have never been written in the book of life because they lack the key component God gave to mankind. The Nephilim do not have a God-breathed spirit. And thus the devils and the Nephilim are the ones who would truly be astonished to see this beast return from the dead. And that is who Klein and Spears believe the seas to be, and the people of the earth, those that dwell on the earth. Who are the heads and the mountains? Well, let's summarize what the passage tells us. Basically, the 7 heads equals 7 mountains, which equals 7 kings. And the details that are given are that 5 are fallen in the past as of John's time, okay? 1 is alive as of John's time, and 1 has not yet come. So it's in the future as of John's time, and that will be number 7. Okay, so whatever's in the future past John's time will be number 7. These same heads and horns were seen upon the great red dragon who empowers the beast, the sea beast, in Revelation 12. William Hendrickson writes, throughout history, especially throughout this entire dispensation, the Lamb constantly defeats and shall defeat every form of anti-Christian dominion. Every kingdom of the Antichrist perishes. But when the Antichrist seems to be completely victorious, his utter ruin is imminent. Let's look at this one, 7 mountains of the Bible. Please don't be lured into this interpretation that there are 7 mountains mentioned here in Revelation are the 7 mountains which are mentioned in the Bible elsewhere. While there's some amazing things that happened on those mountains, and each of those events are pivotal for my faith and maybe yours too, I just don't think it's relevant to what we're talking about here. So be careful about that interpretation or bringing that into what's going on here. Let's talk about the issue of mountains. As was the case for calculating the number of the beast, wisdom is required to understand the next portion of the mystery revealed by the angel. It seems odd that 7 hills should be equated with the well-known topography of Rome, because Revelation 17 indicates the identification of the hills calls for special wisdom. Well, why should such a well-known geographical locale to John's first century audience require special theological and symbolic insight for proper identification? Considering so many commentary pages are devoted to just this, Tony Garland thought that, I just thought this comment from Tony Garland was so appropriate, because so many people think these 7 hills are all about Rome. By the way, Istanbul also has 7 hills, and it was the capital of the Roman Empire, and known as Constantinople. Yeah, so I'll throw that one out too. All right, however, even if Rome is what is in view in the days of John and when this revelation was given, it was still meant to symbolize something, to symbolize the world as it is at the time of the end, when the 8th king rules as the final world leader. And that's what we have to keep in mind, okay, as we interpret this chapter, as Stephen Sewell reminds us. The key about Revelation 17:9, according to Klein and Spears, is that it reveals some information about the location of the harlot. They keep going back to Rome on 7 hills and the fact that it was the center of pagan religion for thousands of years. Quote, Rome was taken over by the Roman Catholic Church about 1,500 years ago, at which time it took on many pagan ideas and mingled them with biblical principles. The result is a mixture, a babble of religious truths, and has since infiltrated the mind of man, distracting him from the pure truth created by God. God can still be found in Catholicism, and I would add Protestantism, but they didn't write that. But through its association with paganism, it has seriously diluted God's word. In any case, Catholicism still has worldwide influence. It is possible that in the coming days it might be taken over totally by the enemy to help usher in Satan's kingdom and play his part in opposing God at the very end of time. Unquote. As you can tell, there's a lot of commentary out there assigning this role to the Roman Catholic Church. The issue of seven heads. The seven-headed beasts represent world dominion, which is carried out via seven different world empires in seven different time periods. Each head is a world empire, and there are seven world empires, are kingdoms. In verses 9 and 10, there are seven kings, of whom five have fallen, one is living, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain only a little while. The seven kings, the seven heads equals seven kings. Was means the first six human kings are in the past. Is not Satan, the seventh king is not human. The first six were human. The second is not, it's not human, and is about to come is the eighth king. But the seventh human king, are you following that? It's a little confusing. Five have fallen, one is, and the other has not yet come. The first five kingdoms were Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persian, and Greece. The one is, the sixth human king, are all the kings of the Roman Empire combined as one king. The sixth kingdom was the Roman Empire, which was in power in John's day, and therefore it is from John's perspective. We're now living in the period of the seventh empire, which is the church age empire. There is no human king that rules over this empire. Once the Roman Empire, the sixth kingdom, fell near the beginning of the church age, the kingdom of darkness began its rule as the seventh kingdom, which covers the whole church age from that point forward until the return of Christ. This chapter is primarily focused on the very end of that sixth empire, when the eighth king will begin to rule, but as the seventh human king not yet come. The seventh human king has not come, not in John's day, nor in ours. Many commentators believe the man of sin talked about in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 is the seventh human king that is in view here. And he will rise to power at the end of this world empire just prior to the return of Christ. And I'm quoting Sewell there. The seven kingdoms stand for the apparent perfection of the monstrous kingdom within the eighth. A king who will appear to take the kingdom forward to a new day, but instead will lead it to its destruction. In other words, don't try to match up the emperors of the Roman empires precisely. What matters here is that the monster's kingdom looks perfect and impregnable, but forces from within its own ranks will destroy it, according to N.T. Wright. There are many who believe the Roman papacy formed the fifth, possibly sixth and seventh of the world empires. I find this a narrow view given a world perspective. However, if we limit it to the perspective of Christ's people, which during that time were concentrated in the Western world, then it might make some sense. This was a better depiction of most, and so I went with it. And you can pause this here if you'd like to examine this in a little bit more detail. But let's continue on. Who are the horns, and how we understand this? The 10 horns are 10 kings in the making. They have not received their kingdom as of the writing of John. So these are 10 future kings, and they are given authority for 1 hour. They give their power and authority to the beast to make war on Jesus and his people. Christ will make war on them and conquer them. They will hate the whore, make the whore desolate and naked, and they will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. And then they give their kingdoms all to the beast. Well, there are more things out here than you can possibly imagine on how to interpret this one. Some believe that the 10 divisions of the fallen Roman Empire in 476 were the 10 horns, if you will. And others believe the 10 horns represent a confederation of 10 kingdoms that will arise before the return of Christ. So, on each of these slides going forward, I have proposed a graphic or listed a graphic that may or may not agree with the quote that's listed with the graphic. They are in no way related. What I'm trying to do is to help you stimulate your thinking so that you can read the graphic and also read the quote. And we can chat about this when we get together. On this first one, it's by Stephen Sewell. I'll read the quote to you. Considering the symbolic role the number 10 has in this book, which is order and completion, I don't believe this number should be taken as a literal 10 kingdoms. I think it's likely symbolic of a worldwide alliance of nations that give their support to the man of sin, the 8th king, who will be the final ruler. And here is a graphic on the United Nations Secretary General. We're currently in the 9th secretary, even though it says 10. The first one was just the one that organized it. So depending on how you count, either total of 10 or we're in the 9th elected. The second quote is from KLEIN and Spears. The 10 horns represented additional 10 kings. The beast will govern and control them all, thereby ushering in a one-world government. Just as Jezebel ruled over the 10 tribes in the 9th century BC, the whore will rule over 10 kings again, who will rule over the world. These 10 northern tribes, chosen by God, made their own choice to rebel. The 10 rulers will also be in rebellion toward God. So KLEIN and Spears relate back to a Bible story to gain other understanding. William Hendrickson offers the 10 kings are really all the mighty ones of the earth in every realm of art, education, commerce, industry, government, insofar as they serve a central authority. Self-aggrandizement in opposition to Christ is their goal. In order to reach this goal, they're willing to give their power, and authority to the beast. They reign in company with the beast for just 1 hour. Every worldly ruler has its satellites, and they too generally last only an hour. All these horn kings have one design, mainly to help the beast in its conflict with Christ in the church. And this is reclaiming the 7 mountains of culture. And there are several books about the different mountains of culture that are actually out on the market these days. Another opinion by N.T. Wright. But then come 10 more kings. They're all different ruling elites within larger Roman Empire, kings and princes from the far-flung corners of the world who will finally tire of the mistress Rome herself and will use the bestial, monstrous power of the empire to attack the city that for so long scooped up and sucked in all the wealth and glory that was going. These rebel forces are every bit as much a part of the monster's rule as was the whore herself. And finally, from Sewell, the Confederacy of Nations could very well turn out to be a united Islamic state that rules the world under the leadership of the 12th Imam, the man of sin or the 8th king. It could be that this 12th Imam will lead his people to world dominance. It seems clear that much of the world Islamic dominance will already be obtained before the 12th Imam even shows up. But when he does, the 10 horns, the Confederacy of Nations, will give their allegiance to him. At that point, they will begin an all-out effort to destroy Christians worldwide, which Sewell believes is the war of Armageddon. So who is the 8th king? As for the beast that was and is not, is an 8th, but belongs to the 7th, and it goes to destruction. The beast was in the form of human kings in the first 6 empires, is not through most of the 7th empire, the church age, and it is not ruled by a human king, but Satan himself through the spirit of the Antichrist. as ruler over the kingdom of darkness. There are no human kings in this seventh empire ruling over the world, and that's our time. But rather, each country has their own ruler. And so, thus, Satan rules over this world, which is characterized by a kingdom of darkness. Himself, Satan, is the eighth king, and yet is one of the seven. Toward the end of the church age, just prior to Christ's return, the eighth king will rise to power as the seventh and final human ruler over the whole world. And this is what we would call the term Antichrist, or man of sin, from 2 Thessalonians. He is the true end-time Antichrist. He literally becomes the beast, which is normally viewed as a combination of 7 world empires. These man of sin becomes the 7th human king, but it's the 8th king in succession of world rulers. Satan rules over this world now as the 7th king, but not as a 7th human king. And so thus the current world empire is not, as it was in the days of the previous 6 empires, nor as it will be at the end of the current 7th world empires. So I'm trying to interpret the language that is used in Revelation. Sewell and other commentators believe this king is the man of sin of 2 Thessalonians, a man of lawlessness. He's the actual Antichrist that Apostle Paul mentions in 1 John 2:18, and he'll rule for a very brief time before being judged by Christ at his coming. I saw this graphic online, and it shows 2 options for the understanding of who is the 8th king or the final Antichrist. One believes that this will be fulfilled through a specific individual who will not be connected with any world power or religion. The second understanding is to be fulfilled through Rome, whether that be under the auspices of a new confederation of nations or through the Roman Catholic Church. We cannot say. Again, they are offered here to show some other examples of understanding. KLEIN and Spears offers another comment. In the adversary's final days, he will present himself as the Messiah and will try to fulfill the prophecies of the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims as contained in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran. All 3 prophesy a Messiah who will perform many miracles and will usher in what appears to be world peace. He will tell the world that he is the one true God, and that all religions of the world now have one purpose: to unite mankind and to usher in peace. In fact, he may tell the world that all the world's religions were created by him, and that they all point to and inform mankind about the one true fake God himself. They will make her desolate. The Antichrist will demand the worship of all people, and that's when he and the Confederation of Kings will turn against all the other religions of the world, which is represented by the great harlot, Babylon the Great, the whole world system, according to Sewell. He believes all these terms are symbolic, that desolate and naked refer to the Antichrist's decree to outlaw all religion in favor of worship of himself. In regard to being burned by fire, this has to be symbolic, just as her flesh is obviously symbolic. If the flesh is symbolic, then the burning of her flesh must be symbolic. Therefore, what's being described here is the consuming or the elimination of all the religions of the world so that the Antichrist can receive worship for himself. In order for this world ruler to become the sole object of worship, he must claim and deceive people to believe that he is God himself. All the people of all religions, except Christianity, will believe this deception and give their allegiance to him. Well, I think also that many Christians will be deceived because we're warned so many times in the New Testament about this. So I disagree here respectfully of Mr. Sewell. Finally, he's the true Antichrist of Revelation, not the beast of chapter 13, which is the kingdom of darkness. We've been calling chapter 13 the beast, the spirit of Antichrist. And it reigns all over the world now in our day and throughout the church age up until when this future Antichrist or this ruler comes to power. And verse 17 is a humdinger. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by agreeing to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. God himself puts it into the minds of these leaders to actually give their allegiance to this man for the purpose of unifying the world under its authority. Those who refuse to believe the truth will be given a deluding influence to believe that which is false, and that is refers to the lies of the Antichrist. So those of us who believes in God's truth will even have a hard time, according to 1 Timothy 4:1. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will renounce the faith by paying attention to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons through the hypocrisy of liars whose consciences are seared with hot iron. They forbid marriage and demand abstinence from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected, provided it's received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by God's word and by prayer. And Matthew 24 says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce great signs and omens to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Take note, I have told you beforehand. And there are many other biblical references as well that I've listed here on this slide. It will be easy to unite the world under his leadership if the whole world is believing the same lie about this individual. Until the words of God are fulfilled, I believe this refers to the whole plan of God for the world up to the return of Christ. So what are we going to learn or take away from this chapter, and how might this bring us closer to God? What do you think the vision is all about? Give some time and chat about this, and we will chat about it in small group, but give this time some thought so you can come to the group with some ideas. What we see in chapter 17 is the reign of the Seventh World Empire during the whole church age up to the end of the church age, when the eighth king rises to power and Christ defeats him. This N.T. Wright says this terrifying, multi-layered denunciation of the outwardly delightful and inwardly deceitful city ought to give a pause for serious thought to all of us who live within today's glossy Western culture, and all others who look on and see our glitzy world from afar. Where are all we in this picture? He continues, the brief description of the fall of Babylon, drawn partly from the biblical representation of a punishment of a whore in Leviticus 21:9, and partly from Isaiah's description of the fall of the original Babylon, which never really fell, NT. It anticipates the terrible chapter that's to come, where the judgment of Babylon is spelled out in more detail. N.T. Wright captures the sentiment of the readers at this point. I love this. All this may seem a bit complex beyond the point of comprehensibility. Amen. But the abiding and overriding lesson for the church then and now should nevertheless be clear. The brutal but the seductive civilizations and national empires which ensnare the world by promising luxury and delivering slavery gain their power from the monster, the system of imperial power. Some have called this the domination system, a system which transcends geographical and historical limitations and reappears again and again every century. John's readers already know that this system gains its power from the dragon, the accuser, the Satan. Those who are caught up in the resultant battles need not feel that they are merely part of a dangerous confusion of ignorant armies clashing by night. They are part of the Lamb's victorious army, who will conquer the monster in the usual way, by his blood and by the word of their faithful testimony. Thus it has been, and thus it will always be. I leave you with a message of warning and hope, and you might want to read all of Micah, verses 1 through 10, but let me just read verses 7 through 10 for right now. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Do not rejoice over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. I must bear the indignation of the Lord, because I have sinned against him, until he takes my side and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to the light. I shall see his vindication. And then my enemy will see, and shame will cover her who said to me, where is your Lord? Where is the Lord your God? My eyes will see her downfall. Now she'll be trodden down like the mire of the street. Next week, we're going to continue on with chapter 18, verses 1 through 24, the fall of Babylon. God bless you. This has been a tough go in chapter 17. We'll continue with taking your questions in small group. Meantime, this week, just God bless you as you go, and keep your spirits up. We're making progress.